It is November 1939, and Europe is consumed by war. Poland has fallen to the invading armies of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. As the first snows begin to fall in the continent's northeast, a sparsely populated, newly independent country stands isolated, at risk of being crushed in the titanic struggle. Caught in a deadly strategic dilemma, Finland faces invasion by the USSR. The Baltic nation of just 4 million people can never hope to defeat the Soviet juggernaut. Yet, when the Winter War begins on November 30th, the world watches in awe as the Finnish military halts and severely bloodies the invading Soviet armies in a heroic act of resistance. To understand how this extraordinary feat of arms was possible, we will explore the equipment, the organization, and the tactics of the Finnish army on the eve of World War II.
Get prepared for your own winter survival with today's sponsor, Muskox. They're a Detroit-based company that creates stylish and super comfortable flannels. The materials are 100% cotton and ethically sourced, which makes them a dream to wear. Now, I'm usually pretty averse to traditional flannels, which are hot and itchy, but these have changed my mind. They're soft, light, breathable, and come in a ton of varieties. Muskox's new collection offers a huge choice of versatile patterns and warm colors to rock a great new look for the upcoming season. And I know my dog certainly appreciates having a styling walking buddy. What's more, for every $100 purchase, $10 is donated to support wildlife in partnership with the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. So look good and feel good doing it by grabbing one of these flannels by going to the description below, going to gomuskox.com, entering my promo code Invicta, and get $15 off. Enjoy!
Let's take a step back and briefly examine the emergence of the state of Finland and its armed forces to better understand how these two countries came to the precipice of war. We can begin by rewinding the clock to the 19th century. For many years, the territories of modern Finland were ruled by Sweden, and Finnish soldiers distinguished themselves in numerous wars in service of the Swedish crown, frequently against the Russian Empire. After Russia's victory over Sweden in the Finnish War in 1809, Finland was annexed to the Tsar's empire as an autonomous Grand Duchy. Russian rule over Finland was marked by alternating waves of relative cultural autonomy and repressive Russification, subject to the whims and worries of the Tsars and their advisors. By the turn of the 20th century, growing fears of Finnish nationalism spurred the government of Tsar Nicholas II to begin a brutal program of repression against Finnish language and culture. Concerned that an autonomous Finland commanding its own military might seek independence, and frustrated by Finnish draft dodging, the so-called oppression years saw the disbanding of the Finnish military and the replacement of the draft in Finland with additional taxation. This Russification policy, hampered by Finnish resistance and interrupted by the outbreak of World War I, contributed greatly to seething resentment and organized opposition against Russian rule. While some Finns, such as the future Finnish Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, saw service in the Imperial Russian Army during World War I, Finnish citizens were not subject to conscription, and Finland played little part in the conflict. Nevertheless, the events of 1914 to 1917 set the stage for Finnish independence and for the bloody ideological struggles which followed it. Anti-Russian sentiment, decades in the making, saw the rise in 1915 of the Jaeger Movement, a German-led clandestine program to build the foundations of a new sovereign Finnish army, which saw 1,000 to 2,000 Finnish men secretly travel to Germany. Drawn primarily from the upper classes and driven by nationalist ideals, these men received extensive military training in the Kaiser's army and were organized and deployed as the elite 27th Jaeger Battalion. The Jaegers saw action against the Imperial Russian Army on the Eastern Front in 1917 in the Baltic. Upon their return to Finland, the Jaegers' training and leadership proved decisive in the Finnish Civil War, and Jaeger veterans went on to form the foundation of the post-war Finnish military. In the wake of the collapse of the Russian Empire and the societal upheaval of the February and October revolutions of 1917, Finland seized the opportunity to break away from Russian dominion. The Finnish Senate ratified the fledgling state's constitution on December 6, 1917, and secured recognition of independence from Lenin's Bolshevik government, who was stretched too thin to suppress a Finnish rebellion. But war was to come to Finland soon enough. The climate of revolution and tensions between Finnish Communist Red Guards and anti-Communist White Guard forces quickly exploded into violence. Finland became embroiled in a brutal civil war between January and May 1918. Following the breakdown of governmental control throughout 1917, opposing paramilitary groups became the dominant forces in the cities and towns of Finland. Finnish Red Forces controlled the south of Finland, backed by the country's large working-class urban population and supported with men and weapons by Lenin's Bolsheviks. White conservative forces controlled the country's northern towns and estates, and were supported by Finland's wealthy industrialists and landowners, as well as the German Empire. Critically, the Finnish White Army could count on the support of returning Jaeger forces, whose leadership and tactical acumen proved decisive time and time again in a war fought largely by untrained militias. Equally important was the leadership of Mannerheim, who led the Whites as commander-in-chief, securing victory for Finnish anti-communist forces during the daring offensive actions of March and April 1918. The three-month war saw the deaths of more than 35,000 Finns and widespread use of terror tactics by all combatants, including the perpetration of war crimes against prisoners and civilians. The victorious White forces summarily executed thousands of Red prisoners of war under orders from Mannerheim, and allowed many thousands more to die in brutal conditions in post-war prison camps. Finland was left scarred by the Civil War, but the country's imperiled government and democratic system slowly stabilized throughout the Interwar period. A series of border conflicts in East Karelia and poor relations with the Soviet Union fed Finnish fears of invasion throughout this period. Finnish strategists, including veterans of the Jaeger Movement and the Civil War, established the foundations for a well-trained infantry army. This effort was supported by a paramilitary organization called the Suojeluskunta, the Civil Guard. Directly descended from the Civil War White Guard, they contributed greatly to Finland's wartime preparedness, while also playing a controversial role in post-Civil War political tensions. Their partner women's organization, the Lotta-Svärd, provided enormous additional support in a wide range of auxiliary roles. Military preparations were constrained by severely limited funds, a point of constant and fierce tension between military planners and the civilian government. The result was a well-trained fighting force, highly motivated and underpinned by a sound doctrine, but desperately short of the heavy weapons and ammunition required. Finnish interbellum planning always assumed that the most likely war was one against the Soviet Union, a mammoth foe for a small and poor nation with a vast border to defend. The Defense Council, chaired by Mannerheim, recognized that utilizing the rugged geography of the country would be key to survival in the event of war. A twofold strategy was developed. The obvious route for a Soviet invasion lay in the south of Finland. where the border with the USSR cut across the Karelian Isthmus, just 30 kilometers from the outskirts of Leningrad. The short distance between the border and Finland's second-largest city of Viipuri necessitated a stiff defensive doctrine, designed to blunt and then contain an invading army on the isthmus. If the isthmus were to fall, the invader would be able to unstoppably fan out across the country. Here it was necessary to prepare strong fortifications, a defensive line which would eventually become known as the Mannerheim Line. Consisting of an extensive network of bunkers, dugouts, tank traps, minefields and trenches, and anchored on both flanks by old but powerful coastal guns. These defences were formidable. However, they were chronically underfunded like the rest of the Finnish military, and were incomplete when war broke out in 1939. Finnish doctrine along the vast border north of Lake Ladoga was dictated by entirely different conditions. The front line in war would be a vast wilderness, covered in trees and dotted with lakes, with very few roads and only scattered villages for shelter. Here, Mannerheim outlined a strategy of defense in depth, where outnumbered Finnish defenders would trade land for time, allowing the Soviets to advance into the interior and overextend their supply lines in the unforgiving taiga forests. Shadowed and harassed every step of the way by Finnish soldiers and militias with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Years of attempts by Finnish diplomats throughout the 1930s failed to form a security alliance with their Scandinavian neighbours, and as war loomed in Europe, the country was dangerously isolated. Although Finland and the USSR had signed a non-aggression pact in 1932, Stalin openly decried the threat which Finland posed to Soviet security, fearing that Finland would align with Germany and act as a springboard for a Nazi invasion. Secretly considering a preemptive invasion of Finland, Stalin dispatched diplomats in 1938 to demand assurances that Finland would repel any German attempt to move soldiers into the country and accept a Soviet intervention in the event of a German invasion. The Finnish government reaffirmed its neutrality and said it would repel any foreign invasion attempt, but gave no further allowances. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 and the subsequent Nazi invasion of Poland dramatically worsened Finland's diplomatic isolation and emboldened Soviet demands. Armed with the secret assurance from Hitler that Finland lay in the Soviet sphere of influence, Stalin began pressing for territorial concessions in October 1939. Summoning a Finnish delegation to Moscow on October 5th, the Soviets demanded the surrender of the Karelian Isthmus and strategically important islands for control of the Baltic coastline. In exchange, the USSR would cede large tracts of eastern Karelia to the Finns. These demands placed Finland in an impossible position. The very land that Stalin demanded to ensure the security of Leningrad was the same terrain that gave Finland any hope of defending against a Soviet invasion, and their surrender would leave Finland defenseless. Fatefully, the Finns rejected the Soviet demands, offering lesser concessions that the Soviets in turn deemed unacceptable. With talks at an impasse, the Finnish delegation returned home on November 13th, expecting further rounds of diplomacy. Instead, following a false flag shelling of their own border outpost at Mainila on November 26th, the Soviet Union renounced their non-aggression pact with Finland and, on November 30th, issued a declaration of war. Now that we understand what brought the Soviet Union to invade Finland in the winter of 1939, we can explore the preparations and capabilities of the Finnish armed forces. We will start with an overview of the equipment of the Finnish military, before expanding to describe their organization, tactics, and operational disposition during the Winter War. In terms of equipment, the average Finnish soldier had poor access to modern military gear, but was at least familiar with the harsh winters of their homeland. In many cases, reservists could not even be issued with winter pattern uniforms, being provided little more than a rifle when mobilized. Most soldiers had access to warm winter clothing and white smocks for snow camouflage, though the former were usually brought from home and the latter homemade by families or the lotta spared from bed sheets. Finnish soldiers overwhelmingly also had to self-supply gloves, warm socks, underwear and warm headgear. Helmets were worn rarely, if at all, being both in short supply and too cold to wear in frigid conditions. Skis were crucial equipment for every Finnish soldier, though some units faced shortages, particularly during the early days of the war. Finnish reservist and military training heavily emphasized proficiency with skis, and they were ubiquitous in civilian life, meaning Finnish troops in winter were able to quickly and covertly cover large distances. This provided them with an advantage in mobility over their Soviet foes, and was central to several key victories. The primary weapon of the Finnish soldier was the sturdy Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle, which had been the mainstay of warfare in the region since the turn of the century. Though there was modest production and refinement of the model during the interwar years, most Mosins in Finnish service were the classic M1891 model, many of which were decades old by the time of their use in the Winter War. As the Mosin was also the standard infantry weapon of invading Soviet forces, Finnish troops were readily able to use captured weapons and ammunition. Although limited in availability, Finnish soldiers could count on the effective support of a range of submachine guns, the most numerous of which was the KP-31 Suomi SMG. While only 4,000 KP-31s were available to Finnish forces during the Winter War due to their high production cost, this extremely reliable and rugged weapon proved so influential that it would have a lasting influence on infantry warfighting doctrine. First designed from 1930 by famous Finnish arms designer Aimo Lahti, by 1939 the KP-31 was refined into a cutting-edge weapon of war. Usually armed with a 70-round drum magazine and spare barrels which could be easily replaced in the event of overheating from sustained fire, this weapon soon garnered a fierce reputation among invading Soviet troops for its devastating firepower. Beyond this, the Finns suffered from serious shortages of heavy machine guns, mortars and artillery pieces. The primary MG employed by Finnish forces was the trusty water-cooled Maxim. Many models of Maxim were in service during the Winter War, both of Finnish, Russian and imported designs, totaling several hundred guns. A respectable number for a small military, but far more sparsely available than in the Red Army. Notably, domestic Finnish weapons manufacturers, led once again by Aimo Lahti, made numerous modifications to their MGs which greatly improved their performance and mobility in winter. These included ski mounts and modifications to the weapon's water jacket so that snow could be used to cool the gun. As a result, the Finns could count on far greater reliability from their MGs during the Winter War than their Soviet opponents, whose guns were plagued by problems with frozen coolant and lubricant. Artillery, mortar, anti-tank and anti-air support was limited and eclectic, acquired over the years from various sources. This caused severe logistical consequences for ammunition and spare parts as the war progressed. The most pressing shortages were in anti-tank weaponry, leaving Finnish soldiers ill-equipped to fight the thousands of tanks employed by the invading Red Army. The scattershot collection of around 100 anti-tank guns at the outbreak of war were spread far too thin to reliably counter Soviet armor. The Finns were therefore forced to rely upon mines satchel charges, rugged terrain, and the soon-to-be infamous Molotov cocktail to destroy enemy armor. To this end, the Finnish home front produced 500,000 of these impromptu anti-tank weapons, and they were employed with surprising efficacy, but with corresponding heavy casualties due to the need to close with enemy tanks. Thus we have seen how Finland and Russia were set to collide in the Winter War, and how the defending soldiers, while outnumbered and outgunned, had the critical advantage of mobility and adaptability in the harsh conditions of their home turf. In our next episode, we shall see how these ragtag defenders were cobbled into an army to confront the Russians and what training and tactics they leveraged to withstand the Red Army onslaught. We shall then finally provide an overview of their service history with key examples of their deadly battlefield performance. You can catch previews of upcoming content and grab HD downloads of all our art by joining our Patreon or YouTube memberships page. Community funding helps ensure we can keep making these documentaries and is vital to delivering our high-quality content. A big thanks to our current supporters for funding the channel and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.